Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today across Asia. If you're from India, from Manila, and perhaps even from New Zealand and Malaysia, welcome. This is the first of the three-part webinar series on plastic pollution and climate change titled Breaking the Plastic Cycle, Solutions for a Cleaner Future. This webinar series is organized by Climate Tracker Asia in collaboration with Break Free from Plastic. Today's event is also live on Facebook. I am Usha Daniel. I'm an independent journalist from Malaysia, a host and a former fellow of Climate Tracker Asia. Climate Tracker is a non-profit journalism organization that supports and promotes better climate reporting. Today, we will be discussing the links between plastics and the climate crisis, the industrial expansion of petrochemicals and plastics in Asia Pacific, and some takeaways from INC1 or the Global Plastics Treaty. Our friends from Climate Tracker Asia and BFFP will also offer story grants to journalists and other communicators who can produce multimedia reports on the topic that will be discussed in the webinar. More information about story grant will be released at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, today's webinar, I'm joined by Marian Ledesma of Greenpeace Philippines, Arpita Vagat of Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, GAIA, Gaia, Swati Seshadri of Center for Financial Accountability, and Tricia Farelli of Ayatora Plastic Pollution Alliance. Our speakers have 7 minutes to present their topic. We'll have a Q&A after all the presentations, so please type your questions in the chat window and we'll be addressing them at the Q&A portion. By the end of the webinar, we hope you will understand more about the factors causing the plastic pollutions, the impacts of the crisis on the health of the people and the planet, and the genuine solutions to address the waste problem. So to get this discussion started, let's welcome Marian Ledesma, who will tackle on how the plastic industry exacerbates the climate crisis. Marian is a Greenpeace Philippines Zero Waste campaigner. Prior to this role, she worked as a climate justice and liability campaign coordinator and the country's director's assistants at the same organization. Before working in the environmental sector, Marian was a product development supervisor at Negros for Tomorrow Foundation, managing post-disaster development projects and designing programs for community development, environmental, and microfinance initiatives. Marian.
Thank you, Usha. Allow me to share my screen. Hope you're all able to see it. Right. So this afternoon, I'll be talking about the links between the plastic crisis and the climate emergency. Now, the world is currently facing what they call a triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. And while the plastic crisis belongs to that last category, it's also interconnected to our climate and to how we're currently facing biodiversity loss. So when you look at these pictures, I'm sure you'll see different kinds of climate impacts, intensifying storms, droughts wiping out our crops, heavy flooding. And these are just some examples of what climate change brings to our countries. Now, behind all of these climate impacts is a connection to plastics. And when we're fighting plastic pollution or stopping plastic production, it is vital because it not only affects different aspects of our life, like health, livelihoods, and food, but it also has a direct connection to the climate emergency, and it worsens all of these climate impacts. So this link makes acting on the plastic pollution crisis an urgent task because climate change is the single biggest threat to humankind. Now, more and more people are realizing the connection between our climate and plastic, as they learn about how 99% of our plastics do come from fossil fuels like oil, coal, or natural gas. They realize that these are the same things that are being used in our engines or burned for energy consumption. However, this isn't the full story of plastic and climate's connections, but of course, this is where it does begin. So fossil fuels are refined and then sent to crackers, these facilities where huge amounts of heat and pressure break fossil fuels into molecules that are then turned into the building blocks of polymers. So basically, fossil fuels are just processed to become plastic resins, and then these are made into plastic packaging and products. And these facilities that you would see all throughout the plastic life cycle, different manufacturing plants or refineries, they sometimes neighbor communities like the ones pictured here. And as we can see, plastics and its risk to people and our planet really starts earlier than we think. Now, big polluters would like us to believe that plastic waste is the main problem, conveniently blaming all of the consumers, their disposal practices, instead of the products and product packaging that these corporations churn out. So the truth is that plastic pollution starts here in these pictures. It starts at resource extraction and in the production phase of plastics life. So you'll see that the diagram here taken from A Story of Plastic, it shows the entire life cycle of plastic and the points of greenhouse gas emissions. So basically from the very beginning, the life cycle of plastic produces greenhouse gases, contributing to the climate crisis. Now, to give you a better idea of just how much carbon emissions there are, for plastic, think of this ratio, it's 1 to 5. So for every ton of plastic that is produced, 5 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents are being released into the Earth's atmosphere. Now, these greenhouse gases, they come from different stages of plastic's life. It can be direct emissions during extraction, or it can also be emissions during land disturbance from the extraction process. It can be burning of fossil fuels to generate energy for making these plastics. Transport emissions are another source. You can also get greenhouse gases released while plastic waste is in our landfills or breaking down in our environment. So these are just some of the processes in plastic's lifespan that will result in greenhouse gas emissions. But at every stage, you can be sure that there's always a carbon footprint. Now, when calculated all together, plastic production and waste produce billions of tons of greenhouse gases annually. According to one study that was released in 2021, it's estimated that 2 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents were emitted in 2015 alone. So in that 1 year, you're already reaching billions of tons for your carbon footprint when it comes to plastic. Now, the researchers of that study concluded that a major driver of increasing carbon emissions in plastics was due to increased combustion of coal for plastic production. So they found that most of the carbon emissions coming from the plastic life cycle was mainly due to the growth in plastic production in a lot of coal-based or coal-driven economies. And examples of these are in China, South Africa, and India. So what they found in their estimates is that almost half of China and South Africa's produced plastic are also exported to places like Europe and North America. So as you can see, all of this is really a systemic issue. It doesn't come from one region alone. There's no one state to blame. It really is a global problem, and it's transboundary in nature. And as you can see, plastic's carbon footprint is only expected to get bigger as the plastic industry and big fast-moving consumer goods companies plan to ramp up plastic production. So these fast-moving consumer goods companies, or FMCGs, they are some of the biggest users of plastic packaging. The largest portion of virgin plastic is mainly used for packaging, so making these FMCGs key drivers for the expansion of plastic production. Despite highly publicized climate commitments that you'll see in the news or in their press releases, these corporations are actually doing very little or nothing at all to reduce single-use plastics while still maintaining ties to the fossil fuel industry or to petrochemical facilities. A Greenpeace report called the Climate Emergency Unpacked revealed that 9 leading FMCGs are connected to at least one major fossil fuel or petrochemical company. And these companies, their packaging was traced to manufacturers that were supplied by companies like Shell, Chevron, and Dow. So major fossil fuel companies have also been reportedly making massive investments in petrochemical and plastics. And they consider plastics as sort of a lifeline now that the world is cracking down on fossil fuel usage and oil. So it's obvious how these companies and plastic really enable fossil fuel consumption through their plastic supply chain. But the lack of transparency in these chains or in the logistics really lets companies evade accountability for environmental crimes or human rights violations that are being committed by their suppliers. And it's really why it's important that we have to start talking about the ties between plastics and fossil fuels, because these companies are currently getting away from all of the repercussions of their supply chain. So the impacts do tell us that we have to cut down on plastics, but then companies and industries behind these problems are still using different reasons for why they're continuing to use or depend on single-use plastics. And one of their tactics to distract the audience or to distract the public really is about using recycling and other false solutions as an excuse to continue using plastics. So even the plastic industry themselves or insiders from that industry have acknowledged that they do use recycling as a tactic to distract. And this distraction is for us so we forget about the systemic solutions that is necessary or that are necessary for us to deal with the plastic crisis and climate change. So FMCGs have worked hand in hand with fossil fuel industry to promote plastic recycling, and despite its failures, they're still using it consistently, using it to divert attention away from the necessary systemic changes like policy or reduction plans. And as we all know, only 9% of all plastic waste has ever been created, has always been recycled. But plastic, of course, isn't infinitely recyclable. So that number does drop for multiple processing. And the actual number for plastic that has been recycled more than once is only around 1% or less than that. So now that the corporation's role in the plastic crisis and climate emergency are in the spotlight, we have to keep the pressure on to phase out single-use plastics and call for a shift to reuse. Studies show that reusable packaging is less carbon intensive than single-use packaging. And one assessment showed that if glass bottles for food and drink were reused at least 3 times, it would save around 50,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents every year. And that's just for one kind of plastic, really. Imagine what reductions in carbon emissions we could achieve by switching to reuse and refill for all single-use plastics. So this is really why we need corporations to think about and invest in reuse and refill and make concrete commitments to reduce their plastic footprint. So thank you for listening. And if you have questions, you can reach out. And we'd also like to invite people to support our petition at act.gp/reuserevolution.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Marianne. And I think it's a lot for a lot of the viewers to digest as well on how certain brands and companies are actually very much linked to plastic pollution and globally, on a global scale. And for next, I would like to invite our second speaker for today. And our second speaker is Arpita Bhagat. She is the Asia Pacific Plastic Policy Officer at the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Arpita has led public mobilization, advocacy, and movement building campaigns across diverse issues, including clean energy, sustainable agriculture, climate resilient cities, gender justice, and plastics over the last decade. She will discuss why plastic burning and chemical recycling do not solve the plastic problem, instead worsens the climate crisis. Arpita.
Thank you, Usha. Just give me a second to share my screen. I'm sorry, I guess we should have tried it sooner. Can we go to the next speaker while I figure this out? Is that okay?
Definitely, no problem. We'll come back to you, Arpita. And our next speaker, I would like to invite our third speaker, but now second, Swati Seshadri, who will talk about the build-out of petrochemicals in Asia. Swati leads the Center for Financial Accountability's oil and gas team. While she heads the program, her specific area of work is on investments, policies, and impacts of petrochemicals and plastics industry in India. Over to you, Swati.
Thanks, Ishar. Thanks, Marian, for that very engaging and important presentation on the connection of plastics to fossil fuels. It makes my life a little simpler. And Arpita, I hope you're able to sort out your issues sooner. I hope I don't have issues here. Okay, can you see the presentation? Yes. Okay. So, yeah, what we'll look at is the petrochemical build-out in Asia today. Linking to what Marianne just presented about the impact or the contribution of plastics to the climate crisis, it's important that we understand that while we are calculating the contribution of plastics to the climate crisis, we go back in time and start with looking at what its production, how the production contributes to climate crisis. So we'll have to go back to exploration and extraction of oil, coal, and gas, and then also petrochemicals. But I'm just only focusing on petrochemicals. This is actually a screenshot from a consulting company's website, and they say we are not a dirty old sunset industry, we are an essential industry. And it's important to understand that that is how the industry positions petrochemicals as being essential and defining what essential is or not. While in the slides they talk about the medical industry, they conveniently push in, like you can see on your screen, the packaging film and other kinds of single-use products into what they would categorize as essential. And this is where we need to very keenly understand the petrochemical industry and separate out the different strains of plastics that are used or promoted by the petrochemical and polymer industry. According to an IEA report, the CO2 emissions from the chemical sector was 18% of industrial CO2 emissions. So this is not at all a small amount. This also does not include the production of plastics and emissions during at the end of life or post-production, post-use management phase, or at the waste part of it. So cumulatively, it is a lot more. Now let's understand the petrochemical industry globally and then also in the Asia Pacific region. Petrochemicals are largely becoming the biggest driver of oil consumption globally. Right now, we see that petrochemicals account for 14% of crude oil and 8% of natural gas. In its use. Of course, the large part of it being transport and power. But what we see going forward is that this would increase to almost half or 50% of crude oil and natural gas consumption in the next decades that are coming up. One of the reasons for this is that there is a move to renewable energy when it comes to power and also to electric vehicles when it comes to transportation. However, we know that the big oil companies are not going to stop production and not going to stop profiting over these natural resources. So what they would be doing is shifting from fossil fuel as resource for energy to fossil fuels as resource for material. And petrochemicals, of course, are the biggest chunk of materials that the fossil fuel industry would produce. What the refining industry is doing very well is the way they're setting up the production and refining facilities. They very seamlessly shift from refining for example, from crude oil to petroleum to crude oil to petrochemicals. You have the same facility producing both of them, and within a matter of few days, they're able to shift from production of gasoline to production of petrochemicals. One example I can give you from India is when COVID struck, Reliance Industries Limited, which is Asia's largest petrochemical producing facility, which we have in India, unfortunately, very quickly shifted from producing petrol to producing polymers and petrochemicals for the PPE kits and the sanitizers and all the other things that was deemed essential by the end of the COVID pandemic. Ironic is that the same company, Reliance, managed to make huge profits during the pandemic, while the rest of the world was really struggling, with economy. So there's a general understanding that petrochemicals are far more resilient an industry than petroleum or gasoline. Another example from India, again, is that, again, Reliance Industries, when crude oil prices rise, they stop putting petrol into their petrol bunks, but actually shift from producing petrol to petrochemicals, which they can export for high prices, thereby not being affected by the high rise of crude oil itself. We see that since 1970 to 2015, we see that plastics is a material which has the demand for which has grown exponentially over the past 3 decades as compared to any other material. Second is, of course, cement, and that's the construction industry, which also uses plastics. So plastic is a very, very big component of the developing world today. Yeah. This looks like a very complicated picture, but very simply put, if you look at the right side, which is the output of the use of fossil fuels, on the left is oil, gas, coal, right? Those are the big ones. And on the right, we see the green parts. These are what these fossil fuels are used for. In terms of petrochemicals, fertilizers are a very big, chunk of petrochemical consumption. However, plastic is even bigger than fertilizers. So if you look at what kind of petrochemicals are produced, we find that plastics are at number 1, petrochemicals, pesticides, and pharma follow after that. And therefore, are petrochemicals essential? Again, is another question we will have to keep asking. And how do we define essential is something that's extremely crucial. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region, the projections by various, research institutions and agencies suggest that by 2030, the Asia-Pacific region would have seen a total growth of 35.2% of refined petrochemical production capacity. That's massive for a region which is also a developing region and a region that's already struggling as the dumping ground of all kinds of technologies and other waste of the entire developed world. China would obviously be would add the highest capacities, followed by India and Iran. According to a consultant in the refining industry, he says that half of the refining capacity would be in the globe would be added in Asia by 2027. We're not far away from that. And 70 to 80% of that would be focused on plastics. So this is not for pharma, this is not for fertilizers and food security, but it is for plastics, again, where essential and non-essential, the lines are really, really blurred. In terms of which countries would contribute, in the coming decades to growth in petrochemicals, we see China obviously number 1 and followed by India and Iran. And while China is already implementing a whole lot of plans that it has already announced, India is one which has made several announcements. And, I've not yet gotten on to planning for these countries. It's also important that we stop the investments that would come into the country, for the fruition of these plans. In the Asia-Pacific region, we see that 39% of what we just spoke about, the 50% global growth of petrochemical expansion in Asia, 39% are already under the construction phase. And therefore, it's a very small section of 18%, which is still in the feasibility phase, which we can still push back, but 39 in construction, and everything, all other projects are at various levels of pushback. And this is something that civil society, journalists, academicians, students, we need to really push back on the production of these or the fruition of these facilities so that we don't have more and more plastics in our homes. To give you a global political picture, Asia-Pacific on the far right this is telling us what is the where petrochemicals will be produced in the future. And we're seeing that much of it will be in the Asia Pacific region. I'm not too sure how clear it is on your screens, but the units of the rest of the world go at 0, 50, 100, 150, and 200. But for Asia Pacific, they go at 0, 150, 300, 450, and 600. So you can see that there's a large proportion of fossil fuels that will come into the Asia Pacific region for refining. We are going to be basically holding the shit, so to speak, on behalf of the rest of the world. This is just an example of where we are going to be by 2050 in terms of demand for different kinds of plastics. And clearly, no matter what the Climate Corp is talking about, no matter what discussions are happening in the Global Plastics Treaty, the projections are that plastic production and consumption will continue to increase. My last slide. This is the cumulative capital investment that is being planned globally. The one on top is the clean technology scenario, and at the bottom is the reference technology scenario. The reference technology scenario is nothing but business as usual. If you do not shift to clean technology scenario, then this is what the kind of investments in the Asia Pacific region will be, which is basically 65% of global investments on petrochemical industry will actually come to the Asia Pacific region. And even in a clean technology scenario, 50% of that will come to the Asia Pacific region. So this is something that we really need to worry about. I can't stress enough the importance of understanding that it's not like all of this is going to be consumed by the countries where petrochemicals, polymers, and plastics will be produced, but we are doing this on behalf of the rest of the world. So while the northern countries, while the the so-called developed countries are making commitments at various UN fora and trying to be more responsible in terms of energy, in terms of consumption, they're really just shifting the buck on to the Asia Pacific region, which is also struggling with all kinds of economic crisis and also political crisis. We see that more and more countries in the Asia Pacific region are becoming right-wing and are far more controlling of the civil society than many of even the Western countries. So this is not merely a livelihood issue or a health or a toxicity or a climate issue. It's also a political issue. I know in India, we are, for example, struggling with a very, very draconian government where the pushback to these kind of projects becomes more and more difficult. And so we need to see this beyond a climate and beyond labor issues and beyond livelihood, but really as political issues of who controls the natural resources and who's paying the price for the development of certain parts of the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the eye-opening presentation, Swati. And given that your slides were all really big figures, I think this is something that everyone and all the viewers should be really concerned about in the coming time. And I think I would like to go back to our second speaker, Arpita. Arpita, I think I'll hand it over to you to present your presentation now.
Is it visible? Because I can't make out.
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent. I think Marianne and Swati have done more than half of my job, so I don't have to spend so much time, but just briefly to go over, briefly to just go over what we have been talking about and just sort of, I think, bringing everything together. I just want to recap the plastic life cycle, and it's really the plastic pollution life cycle. And if we know, and we've spoken about it enough, that plastic is eventually a fossil fuel. It is coming from either gas or oil. And every step of this process is not only reinforcing the climate crisis, but also the human rights crisis as a result of the communities who are impacted, the communities who are involved, the communities who are in vicinity of where the waste is dumped, where the waste is processed, given that most of the current practices that are being pushed by the industry and the government that both my fellow panelists have talked about are harmful both for health as well as for the livelihoods of the people involved. And yeah, because plastic is a crisis in all of its life cycle, we have to stop seeing it only as a marine litter problem. That fact that the last so many years it has been seen only at the end of the downstream impacts is problematic. And given the Global Plastics Treaty is being talked about, which is looking at the entire life cycle that Tricia would be talking about, I think we are at the helm of change, at the helm of something good if we come together and give a cohesive point of view and push forward. And also just to remind everyone, especially given that a lot of us are not from the background of plastics and the movement involved, we should know that plastics is not just plastics as monomers and polymers, but also the chemical additives, and about 10,000 chemical additives which have been added in the different stages of its production, which ultimately end up on our plates. So from phthalates to PFAS, we know that they are harm to human health in various ways. And to move forward to the next slide, sorry, I'm still struggling to see what I am projecting. But just to recap, what Marian also talked about is that the rate at which the plastic are being produced is only growing with only 9% that's being recycled. And at current rates, we are going to see greenhouse gas emissions from not just the plastic in the downstream of plastic life cycle overall, from production to consumption, grow up. And at this rate, it's going to be difficult for the global community to keep the temperatures below 1.5 degrees. So the climate community really has to wake up and put notice, and the hope is that the plastics problem is a conversation not just for the plastics treaty, but also different climate COPs that happen every year. And given the demand of plastics is increasing, and you can see it's very clear from this visual from CIEL, is that different the rate at which we are producing plastics is also affecting, is also leading to the carbon dioxide production that different coal plants produce annually. And even so, we know all of this, we have enough evidence, we are seeing the impacts, we are reeling under the impacts. The rational and logical response should be to cut production, to limit the use of plastics as well. But over the next many years, 70 years, if you can see in this slide, you can see that the production is only increasing at the projected rate. It is going to be about over 1,000 million metric tons per year. And it's time for the public and policymakers to rise up. But as we see in the next slide, if you compare the rate at which the plastic production is happening with actual recycling, right? We imagine recycling to be the ultimate solution. We imagine that if a product says it's recyclable, it's actually recycled. And when you say recycle, it is actually converted into a product that is usable, that is healthy, that is safe to use. It's actually not the case. And the public and policymakers and citizens are realizing this, but the industry, which is feeling the heat, is continuing business as usual and is finding different ways to continue business as usual that we're going to be talking about. And of course, curbing production is not what the industry would like to do, because plastics is extremely cheap to produce, extremely versatile as a product. And therefore, it is important for us to talk about what I'm going to be talking about next. And to just talk a little bit about what the industry is selling as a solution, whether it is incineration, waste burning, and incineration itself comes in various forms. The problem is that you can't just create or destroy matter, as anybody who has read basics of science would know. So when you apply any process where you are burning plastics, where you're trying to basically make the problem disappear, which we often try to do, especially in regions where it is becoming a crisis. It's suffocating our water, it's suffocating our land. We are running out of land to store waste. You can't just get rid of something, right? You get the toxins. If you burn it, whether it's burned in controlled fashion, as we would like to imagine, there is toxins that are produced that come out as dirty fuels, as greenhouse gases, as contaminated water, soil, and very small amount of any product that can be used. And Marian has already talked about how much 1 ton of plastic emits, so I'm not going to go into that. But just to show you here visually what plastic burning, waste burning in an open site versus in a control, what we like to imagine a controlled facility would look like. Eventually, labor is involved. Eventually, these sites, whether they are controlled, as we like to believe, or they're open, they affect the communities which are living nearby with toxic contaminants. And just to give you a very brief outlook, given that this is a fairly public webinar, I didn't want to go into too many technicalities. Essentially, when we think about waste burning, when we think about incineration, it's three different processes more generally, and we believe it's working. Pyrolysis, gasification, and incineration. Essentially, waste is burned in different levels of oxygen. There is a certain step of cleanup that is, again, requirement, which requires people, and the release of gas, oil, and char, which requires a certain treatment to be further dumped, whether it's ash or it's oil or it's char. And given that we are in the Asia Pacific, we are using more and more of these facilities, both from the government side and from the people who are looking for easy solutions. The compliance is limited, the monitoring is limited, and therefore we end up with what we end up as more and more pollution of plastic. Also to remind everybody.
Excuse me, before we move on to your next slide, would just like to request you to put your full screen on, because I think a lot of our viewers can't really see your entire presentation.
Okay, let me see how I can do that. Just 1 second. Okay. Is this better in any way?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
I can also do this. This would be better. Yeah?
Yes. Thank you.
Perfect. So just to remind everyone that waste to energy incineration, that various studies and reports that have been carried out have proved that this process is actually the most carbon intensive to generate electricity. So it's far from being the solution that is pushed forward, whether it's whatever, when you compare it with coal, biomass, oil, LFG, or gas. Given also the fact that when any nation or any region goes for incineration, it's usually because they don't have zero waste systems in place, especially segregation or composting. And often what ends up being burned is mixed waste, which is more toxic, which emits more biogenic carbon dioxide and other gases, which are harmful for our planet and our health. I am so bad at this. Here we go. And sorry about that. And it's also financially unfeasible for developing countries. You can look at different levels of expenditure, whether you look at sanitary landfills, composting, anaerobic digestion. Waste to energy ends up being more expensive compared to all other processes that are involved. Yes, moving forward to chemical recycling, which is another new term that has come up in recent times. And here you can see difference between mechanical recycling that involves more people, that is currently being practiced by a lot of the informal waste pickers, waste recyclers, waste workers in countries like India, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on, where plastics are broken down into flakes and pellets to produce new products, which of course is not the safest way to produce new products, but it's still it's better, it's less energy efficient, it's more energy saving than the chemical recycling process, where polymers are essentially basically plastics are broken down through in energy intensive processes like pyrolysis, gasification that we saw before, and produced into new products. And as I go forward, you will see that both of these products lead to fossil fuel emissions, lead to production of gas, leads to production of carbon dioxide and other issues, other problematic things. So essentially, this is not showing everything that I had on the slide. Whether you think about waste to energy, you talk about plastic to fuel, pyrolysis, plastics to road, plastics to brick, plastic credits, which is increasingly becoming more popular, advanced thermal treatment, compostable plastics, bioplastic. These are all fall solutions, and the industry would like to believe that these are solutions which are good for the environment, which are more advanced, which are technologically sound, but essentially it's the same problematic solution. It's not dealing with the actual problem, which is producing more and more plastics and in ensuring that plastics are in circulation. And when I say plastic, these are all kinds of plastics and not just plastics which are necessary like for health purposes and so on. So what I would like to remind everyone is that we would like just transition. We would want waste pickers and workers to be included in different levels of decision making. We would want solutions which are supportive in their livelihoods, which recognize them, which provide them with access to social provisions, especially what we heard recently a lot is provision of healthcare, health insurance, and so on, so that they can be rightfully shifted. And in very recent conversations that we've had with waste pickers, we had a waste pickers appreciation day on the January 28th. We also know that waste pickers themselves want people to stop using plastic, to not have so much plastic available, because they can generate their income from composting, from collection, and from rightful recognition through formal systems that the government can put in place. And therefore, it's time, we think about communities also who are impacted through dump sites, through landfilling, through waste burning, and through waste dumping, indigenous communities, fishing communities, and so on. And it's important to involve them in consultative policy-making processes, especially when we look at different solid waste management rules, EPR, and bans that are currently in place, which disproportionately exclude the communities whose livelihoods, whose health, and whose everyday living is impacted through plastics production and dumping. And of course, we have the Global Plastics Treaty. We have the different alliances and networks of waste workers and waste pickers participating there. And the hope is that whatever is decided, it will be for the welfare and the well-being of these communities. Because if they are not in a good place, the rest of us who are plastic consumers are also going to be not in a good place. So with that, I want to conclude. There are certain really great publications that we have available. I'm hoping I'm going to be posting the links to these, and you can go through different very recent publications that would be useful for your understanding. And of course, both me and my colleague, Yobel, who is actually the Climate and Energy Officer and an expert in anti-incineration technologies, is available for any questions, for any concerns, for any consultation that you would like to have. So with that, I'll pass it back to Usha.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Arpita. And I have to say, the solution for just transitions, including workers and waste pickers, is definitely something that everyone should look into, and not only in India, but I think it goes across the globe and Asia especially. So for our webinar's last speaker is Trisha Farrelly, who is the co-founder of Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance and the associate professor at Massey University in New Zealand. Her area of focus is national and international governance to reduce virgin plastics or fossil fuels and to regulate toxicants in plastic production. Trisha will discuss how the Global Plastic Treaty is shaping up post-INC 1, and she will also present an overview of the positions of Asia-Pacific countries. Over to you, Trisha.
Great, thank you. Are you able to see my screen well there? Terrific, okay. Thank you, and thank you very much for having me, Climate Tracker. It's lovely to be here. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the Plastics Treaty, and we've had one intergovernmental negotiating committee that was in Punta del Este in Uruguay, and so I'll just give a little bit of an overview about that. I've also been asked to give a little bit of an overview about Asia Pacific country positions. There are many, there are around 56 of those countries, so I won't be speaking in detail about all of them, but I'm going to try to give you a bit of an overview, and also some things that I've been asked to talk about today too is some of the things to look out for. So what I will say is that at the INC 1, that was the first meeting for negotiating the Global Plastics Treaty in Punta del Este, Uruguay, there was a decision for the Secretariat to produce an options document for what could be in the treaty. Those are the key elements that we would like to see in a Global Plastics Treaty. And this would include things like control measures, core obligations, possibly some voluntary actions and means of implementation. And if you wanted to have a look at any of the submissions that have been made on those elements, those are publicly available to everybody on the UNEP INC website, and I do encourage you to look there. At the moment, there are over 170 submissions from countries and civil society organisations. Currently, from looking at the website just yesterday, there are 7 submissions from government so far, because the submission deadline is until the 10th of February. So I'm sure that all the UN member states, the countries, are busily getting together their submissions in preparation for that 10th of February deadline. One of the government submissions is from Tonga, which is from the Asia time issues for those delegates. Trying to spread their small number of staff across a number of different portfolios at this time. So just a bit of a feedback about INC 1 from me. I saw that there were a lot, actually, surprisingly, pleasingly, a lot of references to the fact that 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels, those conventional plastics. There were some pleasing references to plastics in quite a different way than we've seen at the UNEA, through the UNEA process that preceded the INC process. The UNEA process was around building the mandate, or eventually came to building the mandate for the treaty that we see before us now. And so now we're seeing language around plastics as a complex mix of chemicals in ways that we haven't seen before. So that's really interesting. We've even seen some countries, and New Zealand was an example of that, making interventions at INC 1 for the removal of subsidies for fossil fuels and petrochemicals. So that's also quite pleasing to see. And many references to plastics as a novel entity that presented within our planetary boundaries framework, and that as novel entities, plastics are now have already exceeded those planetary boundaries. So there's a really strong discussion there around fossil fuels, around chemicals at INC 1, and we're seeing those most definitely from civil society organisation submissions. And the deadline for those submissions for civil society was originally the 6th of January and then was extended to the 13th of January, and we're still seeing some more of those coming in. Just a final point that I'd like to say about my some of my takes from INC 1 is that there was a lot of references to climate change because of the references to fossil fuel-based plastics. And that there was a really rigorous conversation around a different, what the kinds of regimes were that we would look to see. There's 2 different sort of divergent regimes that we were seeing in asks from countries at this point. One was really for a top-down mandatory legal approach, and the other was more of a sort of bottom-down approach, where we were seeing countries pushing for voluntary national action plan-driven treaties, very much like the Paris Agreement approach, which, as we know, is not particularly effective. So we're looking to see something more of a mandatory legal regulatory framework that includes national action plans, most definitely. In fact, it absolutely needs really comprehensive national action plans to support a global plastics treaty, but certainly more of a global cooperative approach to that. We're also starting to also talk about the fact that, of course, plastic pollution is part of a triple threat, which includes climate change, biodiversity, and waste, chemicals waste, and pollution. And so therein lies conversations too around policy integration to ensure that those multilateral environmental agreements are speaking to one another across climate change, for example, and biodiversity loss, so that we're not duplicating the treaty that we're forming up with those other MEAs, but we're actually complementing those and working with those and alongside those. I think that's probably enough, really. There's lots more I can say about my feedback from the INC 1, but I would just like to report too, I guess, coming out of that the Secretariat for the INC is organising a workshop in just a few hours. In fact, it's a Nairobi time GMT 3+3, so it's going to be 2 o'clock in the morning my time in New Zealand tomorrow morning, and that workshop is to present the documents for submission so far to the INC. So if you're interested in seeing 2-minute snapshot views of how different organisations and potentially countries too are submitting, there's an opportunity for you as well there that is open to anyone to attend. There's also currently on at the moment the open-ended working group 1.2 for the Science Policy Panel. That's for the sound management of chemicals and waste to prevent pollution. That's running from the 30th of January to the 3rd of February in Bangkok. It's an in-person only event, and I'm looking out for that with some real interest, because really the call is for quite a separate science policy panel specific to plastic pollution, knowing, as we've heard from all these wonderful speakers already on this call, that this is a really complex issue and that we need a science policy panel that deals specifically to plastics, to deal with the full lifespan of plastics and all its complexity, including issues associated with justice, just transition, and so forth. Now, there's flags to look out for that I've been asked to talk about. I think we've heard quite a few of them, and quite a few of them are going to come out of my very, very quick run through some of the Asia Pacific submissions, or at least their country positions so far, as we wait for the submissions from countries to come through. Some of the flags you've heard are around chemical recycling. They're around, I guess, a techno-fix approach to plastics rather than a systems approach, rather than looking for this interconnected, more complex cultural approach to dealing with the problem. We're looking for references to best available technologies, techniques and practices, or BAPs and BASs, some of you will be familiar with. That's great, but without the precautionary approach, we are kind of running roughshod over the precautionary approach and going straight to technology. So I'd be very aware of that. If there's any omission to references to remediation, no references to compliance mechanisms, compensation for damage. If there's overemphasis of, and we've heard too from the speakers, overemphasis on plastics alternatives or substitutes without looking at potentially the some of the regrettable substitutes and the impacts that can come out of those. And most of us, I think, who are attending this panel know those well already. Lack of attention to controls of fossil fuel prospecting as well as extraction, the need to cap plastics or fossil fuel-based plastic polymers, not just to production, design and controls, but also right at polymer stage, is really important for us to listen for. We should be hearing that, not the lack of that. A lack of attention to the risks associated with recycled polymers as well, not just virgin polymers. I don't think we're hearing enough about that. Lack of attention to not non-toxic and safe economies, but also just economies, and the relationship between plastics and carbon emissions and biodiversity loss is not yet really being made. Plastics credits has also been noted here, and there's a number of other ones as well, but there's probably not enough time to cover that. Right, speeding through here. So there are 56 Asia Pacific member states, 7 are oil producing, 12 are plastic producing countries, and only seven are members of the High Ambition Coalition from the Asia Pacific region, which is surprisingly low. And here are the countries noted here. Only 2, well, there's 2, actually I shouldn't say only 2, because actually of all of Asia Pacific, 2 are from the Pacific Islands region. So that's quite high, relatively speaking, I would say. Now I've taken some of these graphs here from the matrix, Greenpeace's matrix. So Marion, your colleagues, thank you very much to Greenpeace for your terrific matrix. Now, these tables are not necessarily complete. These are in process, but this is to give you some idea of where we're at the moment with BFFP members completing the matrix as the attending INCs and intersessionals and receiving information from CSOs and member states through the INC process. So here's a snapshot of plastic production cuts and some just transition. You can see, for example, that here on the left-hand side, your plastic production cuts, You've got unsupportive in the purple, which is interesting. Supportive in the blue are probably the most interesting. But if we look at these pie graphs and we look at the neither supportive or unsupportive or almost supportive, that's when we can see the work needs to be done. So if you are familiar with member states who are engaged in this process, these are the areas that need that little nudge to get them over the fence from this middle of the road space. Just quickly going through here, single-use plastics and waste pickers were other elements that were in the matrix for us to have a look at in this graphic form. You'll see that you've got supportive in the green for single-use plastics, so that's great. There was quite a few attendees at the moment who are on board with that, but you've got also an equally large amount that are almost supportive, so we need to push those over the line, off the fence and into the green over there as well. I'm just going to scoot further down. I think waste pickers have got small wedges here because it really hasn't been, it's only just started to really pick up as part of the conversation, at least for member states. It's a lively conversation for CSOs. The global approach here, you'll see that supportive, here you've got a fairly decent wedge, but it's interesting to look, I'm just going to scoot over here to national action plans, because this is where we're looking at a national action plans approach versus the global approach. And we'll see here we've got almost supportive in the blue and we've got supportive in the green. We want to lessen those because we were actually wanting to push up to the global approach that we saw in the previous diagram. Now I can see I'm going to be running out of time quickly here, so I'm just going to scoot over here and just let you know about the Pacific Islands Declarations. 14 independent states that I've been working closely with in the Pacific region. They've signed a declaration, and this is kind of a snapshot of what's included in that declaration to show all of those countries' position because they have signed up, all 14, to that declaration. What we need to push them on, really, as you can see in the unknown area here, is waste pickers, reuse and refill, and just transition. So we'll be working more with those countries on that. And they're unsupportive of a national action plan only approach, which is good because it means that they're more supportive of the global. There are some other Asia Pacific country positions I have here. I think probably because of time, I can show you snapshots like this, but I think I might leave it so that if there's any questions from those who are in attendance, I can speak to any of those because I have the information at my fingertips. So I'll just stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tricia, for your presentation. And I think after listening to all 4 speakers today, we have a lot to digest in understanding the connection between plastic, petrochemicals, and climate change. So now we will move on to the Q&A session. And I actually have a couple of questions for our speaker. And my first question is actually for Arpita. As we understand, lower to middle income countries are they find it almost incapable of managing plastic waste versus the usage, given that there's no right infrastructure. And one example is Malaysia. Malaysia has just recently started to embrace circular economies because of the rising use of plastic in the nation. So would there be a safer alternative to remove plastic from our environment other than using incinerators, even waste to energy, and even chemical recycling, as you mentioned?
Yeah, of course, we've been talking about systemic approach quite a lot. I think Marian also spoke about it, and there are successful examples. We just had the Zero Waste Conference last week. There are really successful models of refill, reuse approach that have been adopted with safer and healthier alternatives. Eventually, we know that recycling would have to continue given that livelihoods depend on many informal waste sector, waste pickers, waste workers for some time. But during that time, I think the key call for action that Tricia also talked about is to reduce plastic production, is to have policies which are gradually over time creating a need for plastic caps or plastic bans. So starting with things like styrofoam cups to plastic straws and everyday usage things that can be easily replaced, that are really not necessary but are pushed through different packaging methods by different hotels, restaurants, industries. I think that's the first thing to do. And as you gradually do that through policy, through industry support, through people's own willingness to participate, you can gradually phase down the need for plastics. And eventually, I think as we have a strong treaty as well, we would have caps on production, bans, and stronger enforcement of things like extended producer responsibility for the time being.
All right, thank you for your answer, Ms. Arpita. And I think I have several more questions. And my next question is for Swati. Swati, I understand that you've covered India as a whole on petrochemicals industry, as well as how plastics is being produced there. Are there any policies that has been shaped in India that is proven to be a solution to this issue? And could it be applied across Asia? And you mentioned that one limitation is politics, and politics is one of the limitations to move forward. And where do you think that India has managed to overcome that and that can be applied across Asia?
Well, I don't know if I'm particularly pessimistic or that's how the situation is, but so India is not looking to move away from petrochemicals or plastics. It is looking to become the petrochemical hub in the Asia Pacific region. So it's quite the opposite. The policy pushes the petrochemical industry to thrive rather than move away. The reasons are that the two richest people in this country have made their money. The older, richer family made its money on oil, and the newer, richer family made its money on coal. And obviously, they don't want to allow policy to move away from fossil fuel consumption. Unfortunately, our government put up, for example, coal blocks for mining, 150 coal blocks for mining just a couple of months ago, while, the climate discussions are going on at COP. And India is, Adani is the second richest person in India is setting up a coal to PVC plant in India. And the coal PVC is bad enough. Coal to PVC is that much more harmful, climate, environmental, and every other way, than PVC produced from some other source. And so we're seeing an opposite push here in India. If I were to reflect on India and the INC, for example, they didn't even turn up physically at the INC. They were there online. And they very much are talking just like Saudi Arabia, where they want national action plans. They want, the common but differentiated goals. And so actually India is a bad example of where we should be or the kinds of policies that we need to produce. Also that these particular industrial houses are very, very aggressive in their response to civil society organizations. So typically you get bumped off, as in finished off, if you try and fight too hard against these companies. So like I said, I don't know if I'm pessimistic, but that's the situation, at least today in India. So let's not learn from here. Let's learn what not to do from India, actually.
I appreciate your honesty, Swati, and I think there is always optimism and also pessimism. And I think there's a lot that we could take on from listening to your presentation, as well as your answer to this question, because I really wanted to know if there were actual solutions, or are there only issues there that other countries could look into and maybe not repeat the same mistakes. So my next question is actually for Professor Trisha on the Global Plastic Treaty. And I understand that you mentioned just now that there were regimes requesting for a top-down mandatory approach, legal approach. And do you think that such approach would work for countries in Southeast Asia and also globally?
I think it's the only way it's going to work for everybody collectively, because this is a global transboundary issue. And I think that if we start talking about, is it going to work for them, and is it going to work for them, this will never work for anybody, quite frankly. So I guess, and we know that there are only a small number of the most powerful at the top in terms of fossil fuel extraction and companies and petrochemical businesses and plastics producers and packaging companies, and I really feel that if we work around regulating at the top of pipe at that small number of the most powerful that have the most power to make the most change, I think we're going to have the greatest effect globally on this global plastics crisis. If we turn the tap off its source, of course, we need to be dealing with all of the other stuff in terms, and I've talked before about remediation and about retrieval and about, increasing collection rates perhaps, and all of those sorts of things are very important. But actually we can go and mess around as much as we like with all that stuff at the end of the pipe for a selection of different countries who have the most problems or have the most political will to work with that. But we will never solve this global plastics crisis unless we deal right at the top of the source and turn that tap off and clean up the system to ensure that we've got a non-toxic, safe and just circular economy for everybody.
Thank you for that answer, Professor Trisha. I really appreciate that. And I think I will have my final question, and it is for Marian. Marian, earlier you mentioned that you mentioned FMCG brands, and a lot of these brands are highly responsible for contributing to plastic pollution. And FMCG brands seem to be actively involved in this really famous word that everyone is using now, greenwashing. They are brands that are known to be the largest contributors to plastic pollution, have actually sponsored the recent COP27. What does this mean for the future of plastic, and what message does it actually bring to the consumers?
It's actually unfortunate that the UN is tapping all of these corporations to sponsor meetings that are discussing climate, and it also doesn't bode well for discussions when it comes to the plastics treaty. If something as developed as the climate talks have already been sort of co-opted already by corporations, then that is a significant threat. All of these corporations' involvement in agreements and even in legislation at a local or national level, because they do spend resources to try to lobby for these legislation, well, it means that they can easily influence it, try to shift the conversation away from reduction of plastic production, and also shift the conversation away from any reusable alternatives to single-use plastics. And what eventually happens is that a lot of our policies or laws, they get watered down because of the interference or interventions of corporations. And at the same time, it also doesn't bode well for the kind of solutions that countries usually embrace, because these corporations are so good at marketing all of these false solutions, like what Arpita talked about, chemical recycling. It can skew the public's and decision makers' perception about the kind of solutions that they should be looking at. And for the Philippines, for example, because of a lot of industry influence, we're seeing that our extended producer responsibility law only solely focuses on downstream interventions, so waste recovery, waste management. It does mention things like more upstream measures like reduce production or reuse and refill, but because of the influence of companies, we're seeing most of the government expend resources on just waste recovery or recycling, when it should be a balance and really more of a focus on reducing plastic pollution right from the very start.
Thank you very much for your answer, Marian. And I think I have concluded the questions that I have, and I think that's all the time we have for the Q&A session. And to summarize the entire conversation that we had today, and I think plastic pollution has been an issue not only in Asia, but also globally for many, many years. And we understand that this issue is actually from top down, and a lot of big players behind the plastic pollution issue is actually big companies and petrochemical companies. And somehow plastic pollution, the consumers of plastic is receiving the brunt end of the blame. So we're being told not to use plastic, but somehow there are people producing plastic. So I think, as Professor Tricia mentioned earlier, the plastic treaty is a way forward where we can come up with formulation as well as policies in place by governments and countries where we can tackle plastic pollution as a whole. And like also Tricia said, that it is not a me issue, it's not a you issue, but it's a us thing, because I think it spreads globally, and plastic pollution would not end if there are no alternatives to using plastic, and they are large producers continue to producing plastics, especially petrochemical and FMCG companies. With that, I'd like to conclude this webinar. I'd like to thank each and every one of our speakers today for sharing their expertise, for putting together their very wholesome slides to explain the issue and where the problem stems from. Thank you very much, everyone. Marian, Swati, Tricia, I really appreciate your time. And ladies and gentlemen, Climate Tracker Asia is actually inviting journalists to submit multimedia story proposals for our initiative titled Uncovering the Plastic Crisis, Stories of Pollution and Solution. And this is also in partnership with BFFP. We are looking for stories related to the topics discussed today, as well as stories on waste trade, microplastics, impacts of plastics on human health, sachet culture, and single-use packaging. Solution stories and those highlighting how communities solve the crisis are preferred. Grantees must publish high-quality reports on plastic pollution and solutions before March 31st, 2023. They'll receive a story grant amounting to €200, mentoring and networking opportunities. Please feel free to submit your pitches until February 28th, and applications will be reviewed every Friday, so send your pitches right away, as we only offer 12 story grant opportunities. Being a former Climate Tracker fellow myself, I have to say this is a wonderful opportunity to learn from experts that have all the insights and have all the capabilities to drive you into reporting the plastic pollution stories really, really well. And that's all the time we have for this session. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I am also inviting you to attend our webinar on plastics impact on human health on February 14. It is Valentine's Day, it's a day for love, and it is the day that you could love the environment by joining this webinar, and our webinar on corporate accountability and solutions on February 28th. To learn more about ending plastic pollution, do visit www.breakfreefromplastic.org, and please read our stories on website climatetracker.org and climatetracker.asia. Thank you very, very much. Have a lovely evening ahead, and we'll see you in the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.